to the Friday webinar series. I must mention that this series that we are conducting now is along with G20 Task Force 5. So this is the EGROW plus the G20 Task Force 5 series that we are conducting. In the series that we are working on now, we have conducted various webinars. We have covered various issues. We have covered monetary policy last week. Before that, we had covered climate finance. So in that series today, we have taken the fiscal issues, and under the fiscal issues, we are going to be discussing about the global fiscal coordination. We are going to be talking about taxes and debt. And as we were just mentioning, this issue of debt has become very, very important. Even in the spring meetings at the IMF, this issue is being discussed. So let me formally welcome you to this webinar. The webinar today is chaired by Dr. Arvind Virmani, member of Niti Aayog, and we have 4 speakers today for this webinar. We have Professor Barry Eichengreen, Professor Govinda, Professor Ashima Goyal, and we have Dr. Rathin. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce the members, the panelists, and then I'll briefly introduce the chairman, who's already, actually all the panelists are very well known, and then I'll hand over the session to Dr. Virmani. To start, let me introduce Professor Barry Eichengreen. He is the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1987. He is a Research Associate of NBER and Research Fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research, London. In 1997 and 98, he was Senior Policy Advisor at the IMF. He is a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, class of 97. He is also the convener of the Bellagio Group of Academics and Economic Officials and chair of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He has held various fellowships. He has been a fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, Palo Alto, and the Institute for Advanced Study, Berlin. He is a regular columnist for Project Syndicate. His books, he has so many very good books. His books include The Populist Temptation, Economic Governance and Political Reaction in the Modern Era, 2018, How Global Currencies Work, Past, Present, and Future. And that's very interesting. I think with Professor Barry Eichengreen, I would like to have a special session on that. Well, we do not know which is the best, which is the international currency now, dollar, yen, and Indian rupee. We're all into it. So how global currencies work, that will be interesting. The book written in 2017, The Korean Economy from a Miraculous Past to a Sustainable Future. So he has a number of books to his credit. He was awarded the Economic History Association's Jonathan R.T. Hughes Prize for Excellence in Teaching in 2002 and the University of California at Berkeley Social Sciences Division's Distinguished Teaching Award in 2004. He is also the recipient of a doctoral honoris causa from the American University in Paris. Professor Govinda has been a member of the 14th Finance Commission. He was the director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. His past positions include Director, Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, and Fellow Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, ANU, Canberra, Australia, and Professor, of course, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, 85 to 95. Professor Rao has a number of advisory roles. He was a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He was a member of Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, FSLRC, and High-Level Expert Committee on Universalizing Healthcare, member High-Level Expert Committee on Efficient Management of Public Expenditure, and member advisory group of eminent persons to advise the finance minister on G20 matters. Professor Rao has done extensive work on value-added tax, GST, and was chairman expert group on taxation of services. He was member board of governors in Institute of Economic Growth, Institute for Social and Economic Change, and Madras School of Economics. Next, I'm going to introduce Professor Ashima Goyal. Professor Ashima Goyal is the member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the RBI. Earlier, she was member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. She has published extensively. She has also authored and edited a number of books, including Macroeconomics and Markets in Developing and Emerging Economies, a concise handbook of the Indian economy in the 21st century, Oxford University Press 2019. She also edits the Rowley Journal of Macroeconomics and Finance in Emerging Market Economies. And she has provided consultancy to ADB, UNDP, RBI, UNSCAP, World Bank. She has also published extensively in different places. She was a visiting fellow at the Economic Growth Center, Yale University, USA, and a Fulbright Senior Research Fellow at the Claremont Graduate University, USA. Her research has received national and international awards. She won 2 Best Research Awards at the GDN meeting at Tokyo in 2000 and Rio de Janeiro 2001, selected as one of the 4 most powerful women in economics. A thought leader by Business Today in 2008, was the first Professor P.R. Brahmananda Memorial Research Grant awardee for a study on history of monetary policy in India since independence 2011, which was published by Springer in 2014. Our last speaker for the day today is Dr. Rathin Roy. Dr. Rathin is a senior visiting fellow at CPR. He was just recently director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He is now Managing Director, Research and Policy at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI. His policy interests and research has mainly focused on fiscal and macroeconomic issues pertinent to human development in developing and emerging countries. He has previously worked as an economic diplomat and policy advisor at the UNDP, with postings in London, New York, Kathmandu, and Brasilia. He has also served as an economic advisor with the 13th Finance Commission, New Delhi. He was also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. The session today is being chaired by Dr. Arvind Virmani. Arvind Virmani is a very well-known policymaker in our country in India. He was now a member of Niti Aayog. He was executive director at the International Monetary Fund from 2009 to 2012. He was the chief economic advisor before that. He has worked extensively in the Planning Commission, and he has also worked in the World Bank. The reforms that we did in 1991, Dr. Arvind Virmani had a role to play in the reforms during that time. He's been a mentor to FICCI and a member of RBI Technical Advisory Committee on Monetary Policy. He has advised on a host of economic policy reforms through hundreds of policy papers, notes, and committee. He has served as member Telecom Regulatory Authority of India and as director and chief executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. He has published in journals, refereed journals, in books and chapters, written over 50 working papers in the areas of macroeconomics, growth and finance, tax reforms, international trade and tariffs, international relations, and national security strategy. With this, I would like to hand over the session to Dr. Arvind Virmani to conduct the proceedings further. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think we're going to run against time, but I can't. I thought I will, because we have 4 speakers. But anyway, I'll just say a few words and keep it short. This thing reminds me of the global financial crisis, which I actually dealt with as chief economic advisor in India. But for those who may not know, the F20 was the group of finance ministers was changed to a G20, the group of leaders to deal with the GFC. And that was probably the first instance where such a large group of countries coordinated fiscal and monetary policy. And so what I recall, I remember is that one of from our side in India, it was kind of interesting because I was in Washington for the meetings, bank fund meetings. And when I came back, before that, of course, Lehman and some of the things had happened. By the time I got here, the whole international credit system had collapsed. And I later, when I got the data, that you could see it, the whole money supply in India kind of was like a cliff, in that month. It just, everything was collapsing. But just to talk on just say something on the fiscal. One of the recommendations which I made before leaving, which my term finished in 2009, and I moved on to the IMF. What I had said was that the fiscal accommodation, which was absolutely critical for dealing with that collapse in growth, again, our growth, collapsed by something like 5 or 6%, and should be withdrawn the moment the GDP comes back to anything close to normal. And that really didn't happen. So I think some of the issues we have is kind of similar. The monetary stimulus lasting too long, the fiscal adding to it, etc. But let me not go into all those. So given our limited time, let me call on Professor Eichengreen to kick off our discussions. Professor?
Arvind, may I ask about the format? How long do you want each of the four of us to speak?
Around 15 minutes would be good, because that will be, almost 1 hour. So maybe 15, 20 minutes we'll have for question and answers.
Very good. I am going to provide some thoughts on debt management. So I presume you can see this,
Yeah.
Good. And the thoughts derive from a book and a paper that I've completed recently, predictably enough. I think the debt problem that the world now faces is quite daunting. I show you here the level of public debt, general government public debt as a percent of GDP, and also the composition of that debt vis-a-vis the foreign official sector, the bondholders, domestic and foreign private creditors, and so forth. So what you can see here for the world as a whole, and my country, the United States, is that following some progress in the direction of fiscal consolidation, the black line was declining prior to the global financial crisis. If not in the US, at least globally, that trend has turned around with a vengeance. Debts have gone up quite dramatically in the wake of the GFC, and again in following the outbreak of the pandemic. There has been an interesting reduction in debt ratios due to the burst of inflation in 2021-22, which raises some interesting issues. And I show you similarly here the situation in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. I think this IMF categorization puts India in the lower middle-income bracket. You can see that the trends are broadly similar. Debt ratios are lower than in the advanced country world, but they have risen by about 50% compared to their pre-global financial crisis trough. So the way this is sometimes put is 60 the new 40? Is a 60% debt to GDP ratio the new normal for low-income countries where the old normal might have been 40%? So it's one trend to bear in mind. The other trend to bear in mind is that look at the low-income country figure on the left, the foreign official sector is progressively accounting for less of this total debt, whereas private creditors, domestic non-bank investors, and foreign non-bank investors, you see the foreign non-bank investors more prominently for the lower middle income countries. The pinkish slice at the top are becoming more important. My message is that for the high income countries, these higher debts are here to stay for a long time. That various projections that we hear, we heard some from the IMF earlier this week about how these debts can be brought down by running substantial primary surpluses for long periods of time. That's not in the cards for the high income countries. They're not going to be able to grow out of these heavy debt burdens easily. The interest rate growth rate differential, R minus G, for the academics among us, is probably going to be less favorable for the high income countries going forward than it has been in the past. Headwinds to growth and the fact that with heavier debts, investors are going to be demanding higher real returns. And inflation will not be a sustainable strategy for bringing down these high debts. You can use inflation as a one-time instrument, and we did that in 2021-22, but the markets are going to react. Many of the same problems face the low-income countries, and if anything more seriously, the fund is right to point to 36 low-income countries as being in severe debt distress. Their debts need to be restructured. That has not, no progress has been made in that direction in the last couple of years. Maybe a little progress was made yesterday. Gang, the governor of the PBOC, said that perhaps China will not insist that the World Bank and IMF take losses on their loans as the price for the big Chinese banks to take losses on their loans. And if the Chinese leadership as a whole agrees, perhaps we can begin making progress on the necessary restructuring of the debts of low-income countries. So that's my message. I will provide you a little bit of substantiation of that, drawing first on this book that came out in 2021. We do the standard debt decompositions in the book, both for some historical cases and some current cases, where the evolution of the debt to GDP ratio over time, where D denotes the debt to GDP ratio, depends on primary budget surpluses. The extent to which governments can run them determines how much debt they can retire. On the interest rate growth rate differential interacted with the inherited debt, that's the second term here, and on everything else, the stock flow adjustment, which picks up one-time bank recapitalization costs, debt conversions, debt restructurings, and so forth. So we regard this, like others, as a useful way of decomposing the determinants, approximate determinants of the evolution of debt over time. We apply that to some historical cases and show that, yes, indeed, it has been possible historically to bring down heavy debts by running primary surpluses over long periods of time. So here's a prime case in point, Great Britain, after the French and Napoleonic Wars. Britain ran primary surpluses year after year for fully 90 years, 9 decades, interrupted only by 1 year of deficits during the Boer War at the turn of the 20th century, and brought the debt to GDP ratio down from 200% to something on the order of 20%. So it has been possible to do historically what the IMF recommended in its World Economic Outlook Chapter 2 on Tuesday, to run primary surpluses as a way of bringing this debt back down to normal, more tolerable levels. This was done because of the existence of a fiscal philosophy of sound finance, emphasizing the need for budget surpluses, low taxes, limited government, because British leaders, parliamentarians understood that they needed to restore their ability to borrow to prepare for a possible future conflict, which of course came in 1914. And because of the limited influence of the working class in Parliament, even after the three Reform Acts of the 19th century, landowners and bondholders were the influential voters and parliamentarians. They bought into the philosophy of sound finance. There was no working class challenge. There was no welfare state to push back against running surpluses for a long period of time. In the United States, the debt ratio coming out of our Civil War in 1865 was lower, but quite remarkably, we ran primary budget surpluses year after year for fully half a century and extinguished that federal government debt because of strong creditor influence over US politics, because the southern states, the former slave states, were opposed to expansive federal spending, which would have undermined their prevailing social, racial order, because limited needs of military spending before 1914, and because the US was able to grow successfully in that period. And a final historical case we look at is France after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, a debt to GDP ratio of 100%, brought down to less than half that level by running primary surpluses year after year for a couple of decades. So it helped that taxation was regressive. The elites who made policy understood that it was mainly consumption taxation, the equivalent of the VAT that fell on the working classes primarily. And they similarly saw taxation and debt retirement as necessary to prepare for another German war, which they saw coming. So it's quite remarkable. I show you those three experiences in the 3 rows of this table. If you can see my cursor, this column labeled decrease is the percent of GDP decline in the debt ratio over the consolidation period. And the next column is the contribution of the primary balance, primary budget surpluses. Primary budget surpluses more than fully accounted for the decline in the debt ratio in all 3 of these cases. The growth rate, interest rate differential did not contribute. And with the exception of this 25%, Chancellor Goshen's 1888 debt conversion, the stock flow adjustment doesn't account for anything as well. So fiscal effort can do it under special political circumstances. And I've characterized those special political circumstances in such a way as to suggest that they are not in place in the advanced countries, or for that matter, anywhere else in the 21st century. Ugo Panizza and I have looked at cases where countries have been able to run large primary surpluses for extended periods of time, and we found them only in a small handful of special cases. Norway discovered oil and gas in the North Sea, and it wanted to sock it away for future generations, so it didn't spend the revenues after 1999. It put them in the Sovereign Wealth Fund instead. Belgium was desperate to qualify for the euro, so to meet the Maastricht Treaty convergence criteria, it ran budget surpluses for an extended period starting in 1995. Singapore has a volatile economy and is in a geopolitically difficult part of the world, has a strong technocratic government. It could run budget surpluses for an extended period after 1990. Most of the rest of us don't find ourselves facing those special circumstances. That was the point of the paper. Large, persistent primary surpluses are the exception to the rule. What about faster economic growth? It could be that COVID has accelerated digitization. Now we have artificial intelligence and chat GPT. I'll tell you a story about that later if time permits. But there's no evidence of faster productivity growth fueling faster GDP growth yet. History shows that it takes time, 10 to 15 years, before new general purpose technologies are fully rolled out and firms adjust to their availability and productivity growth accelerates. That was true of the steam engine at the top. That was true of the internal combustion engine in the middle. And that was true of the personal computer at the bottom. And I submit that we will see faster productivity growth, but only after 2035 or 2040 as a result of the current generation of AI and other related innovations. What about inflating away the debt? Some argue that inflation is helpful under current circumstances of heavy debt, as Daniel Gross wrote last year. Others are more cautious, and they warn that you may get a helpful debt-reducing burst of inflation initially, but then investors will react. You'll get higher real interest rates, and that initial benefit will be reversed. Rui Esteves and I looked at the historical experience with this in an article ungated in the Oxford Open Economics Journal. I will skip some slides here in the interest of time and simply say we looked at debt consolidations of different durations when debt fell by at least 10% of GDP over 5 years, over 8 years, over 10 years. We looked also at 15% more demanding criteria. 15% of GDP falls in indebtedness. And we asked what was the contribution of inflation and the real interest rate. And we found that, yes, if you look over short periods of time, inflation is associated with a decline in the real interest rate on debt. But as soon as you extend the period out to 15 years, that effect goes away and it even reverses itself in sign. So we're very much on board with the view that we've probably already seen the helpful debt reducing effect of a burst of inflation. And that effect is going to go away as we get a combination of inflation returning to target, which clearly is underway, and interest rates ratcheting up as investors, having been awoken to the fact that inflation can happen, will demand higher returns on public debt. So I don't see inflation as a solution here. I don't foresee an acceleration in productivity and economic growth as a solution. I worry about somewhat higher R minus G in the immediate future because of a heavier debt burden that has to be placed with investors. And I don't think the current political constellation in most countries is conducive to running large primary surpluses for extended periods of time. I think that's probably a message that an Indian audience can relate to. So I think in the high-income countries, we will be grappling with a heavy debt burden, which makes for financial fragility and limits fiscal room for maneuver for an extended period. In low-income countries, governments and their creditors will be grappling with the need to restructure debt. So I wish I could end on a happier note, but I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me turn quickly. I won't take time. Professor Rao, go ahead. I think.
Thank you, Dr. Virmani. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Virmani, Dr. Charan Singh. for inviting me to this forum. And, it's nice to be in the panel with at least two people who have written articles in a journal which I'm editing. In fact, Ashima Goyal has written, I edit a journal called Indian Public Policy Review, which is an open access bi-monthly journal. And Professor Eichengreen has written on digital currency with Poonam Gupta. And Ashima has written on flexible inflation targeting in that journal. So I'm quite happy to be in this group. Of course, Rathin was my successor in NIPFP. So it's nice to be with all of you. Professor Eichengreen has given a very good sort of overview. And obviously, what I would be talking about is, what I would be saying is some supplementing what he said. I mean, he did talk about inflation not being a solution to the problem. Productivity is not going to be, going to solve the problem, this thing. So obviously there has to be much greater effort at fiscal consolidation. My focus, what I will be doing is in the first few minutes, I'll be talking about some general issues, general global issues. Then I'll talk about the Indian situation. Again, focus will be on, the problems created by the pandemic and the recovery thereafter. There has been an unprecedented surge in government deficits and debt across the globe during the COVID-19 pandemic. Almost 60% of the low-income countries and 30% of the emerging market economies are presently at high risk of being, or already they are in debt distress. So global debt has increased to over 100%. In 2020, but in the next year, thanks to recovery in many of the countries, it has substantially declined. It declined by about, according to the fiscal monitor, recent April fiscal monitor, it's almost near about 92% of GDP presently. At the same time, there are pressures to increase. There is a huge dilemma. The dilemma is that recovery is still nascent. There is a lot of pressure to increase public spending. And also, there is a lot of trend in protectionism that has taken place, which means that the focus is, sort of going into the domestic, augmenting domestic demand, which means that there is a lot of effort, a lot of pressure on public spending, but at the same time, you have a distress situation and fiscal consolidation has to be done. So many of the countries are faced with this type of dilemma. So they have to undertake the fiscal consolidation while augmenting public spending to revive and accelerate growth and address issues like climate change. The war, the global price increases and interest rate hikes that have taken place have also left very little room in the monetary policy space. So you have a problem both in the fiscal and the monetary policy side. The IMF review of the experience of various countries suggests that even without the debt distress and the strains created by the pandemic, the success rates of fiscal consolidation in many of the low-income and middle-income countries have been very low. They make two different tests. One is, you have you set up the targets and see on which of the, what is the success rate in achieving the, whether how many countries are really able to reach the success or achieve the targets that are set. Or the second alternative is to examine how many of the countries are at least partially able to undertake the fiscal consolidation. And it shows that when judged in terms of the target set, the success rate has been 1 in 5 episodes. And if at least some household have some threshold improvement in the outcomes is taken, the success rate is 2 out of 3. Generally speaking, the review of the literature there suggests that the success rate in the first category ranges from 38 to 50%, whereas that under the second approach, it ranges from 21 to 65%. So, as it is, sort of many countries are unable to really, even when they adopt a rule-based fiscal policy, they are unable to really adhere to the rules. So that's for various political or various other reasons. The IMF has examined G20 countries and found that those with stronger fiscal institutions had important and desirable outcomes. There are 5 important outcomes they talk about. These countries delivered significantly stronger fiscal adjustment. Second, they were quicker to put together a fiscal adjustment plan. Third, they tended to protect public investment in consolidation. Fourth, they tended to implement the plan better because they adhered to the annual budget numbers. And 5, they were better at responding to external shocks and they are able to reallocate expenditures and stick to the original adjustment plan. And further, a strong track record of fiscal management improved the likelihood of successful consolidation because there is a sort of a culture that you bring in. And successful consolidations are typically underpinned by credible commitment to reform and sound program design. Now, so fiscal consolidation should be underpinned by a credible medium-term fiscal framework, supported by a strong fiscal institutions and sound design and robust implementation. Medium-term framework, fiscal rules, transparency, accountability, and efficient public finance management systems help in achieving higher success rates. The IMF studies show that the countries which have independent fiscal institutions like the Fiscal Council have performed better. Finally, fiscal consolidation programs should include well-integrated structural reforms because fiscal consolidation should not stand alone. I mean, there need to be well-integrated structural reforms and capacity development programs to strengthen the fiscal institutions. Now, let me come to the problem in India. In fact, I happen to have written a book which came out 6 months ago. And one of the chapters in the book is public finance in pandemic times. And this book, the name of the book is Studies in Indian Public Finance. And this is published by the Oxford University Press. Now, some of the things that I'm talking about is from that particular chapter, but other than obviously that was written 6 months ago. So, some additional things, have been brought in. In India, fiscal deficit and debt, public debt have been a matter of concern for a long time. But very interestingly, that, we started following the rule-based policy after after 2003, 2004. But really speaking, if you look at Article 292, which, it requires that the Parliament should fix the volume of borrowing. Now, the fact of the matter is the Parliament has never been fixing. In fact, whatever is the borrowing that is stated in the budget is basically taken as given. And Parliament never really undertook the task of fixing the borrowing. And so that's one of the reasons why you need to really have a rule-based policy brought in. So the Constitution really has thought of this particular issue. So formal rule-based fiscal policy was started in 2003 with the implementation of FRBM Act. However, the performance of the policy of FRBM Act, implementation has not been, there is nothing much to rave about that particular performance. The inability to control deficits and debt has led to various obfuscations and impacted on the quality of deficit as well. In fact, Dr. Virmani talked about the global financial crisis, possibly he's talking about the later one. The interesting part is that, sort of the major blow, on the fiscal consolidation started in 2008, 2009. And there were three major decisions taken there, which really led to that. Loan waiver, farm loan waiver, sort of implementation of the pay commission recommendations, and expansion of the National Rural Employment Guarantee from 200 districts to the whole country. And in fact, that, in fact, the budgeted deficit was 2.5% of GDP at the sector. Actually, when oil prices increased in July of that year to $168 a barrel, ultimate fiscal deficit ended up at 7.5. If you take the off-budget liabilities into consideration. So inability to control deficits and debt has led to various obfuscations. So there's an awful lot of off-budget borrowing and various obfuscations have been done throughout the period. And it impacted the quality of deficit as well. In fact, in the initial years, the revenue deficit in the 1990s was about 30% of the fiscal deficit. Now, if you see in 2019, 20, 2020, 21, the revenue deficit constitutes 70% of the fiscal deficit at the center. And even in the capital expenditure, there is a problem. There is the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation monitors the capital projects, and it actually traces the cost overruns. There are 1,520 projects with more than 150 crore turnover, out of which 380 are having cost overruns, and the extent of cost overruns runs into more than 4.5 trillion rupees. Thus, the overall experience with the rule-based policy in achieving fiscal consolidation leaves much to be desired. As I mentioned earlier, there are similar experience. India is not unique in that. There are similar experiences in other countries. There has been suspensions of the rule, taking pauses, off-budget borrowings, changing definitions, resulting in the loss of transparency and accountability. Governments have shown no urgency in implementing measures to reach the targets. The quality of adjustment has left much to be desired. And of course, questions show achievements without really actually achieving the objectives, and they are not uncommon. Off-budget borrowings, in fact, in India, for example, for a long time, food subsidy was paid by the NSSF, National Small Saving Fund. Fertilizer subsidy was paid by the LIC, by the banks and LIC. One public enterprise buying another public enterprise is saying that this is disinvestment money. And then, of course, every finance commission, from the 9th has sort of recommended that the government should follow the accrual accounting system, but the cash accounting continues. And in fact, there have been ambitious, unrealistic targets are placed, and then when you are not able to achieve it, unplanned cuts in expenditure, reducing productivity. Now, pandemic threw the fiscal adjustment completely out of gear. The economy contracted by 5.3% in real terms in 2021, and the contraction in nominal terms is 1.4%. Of course, the heavy lifting was done by the RBI through RBI through a moratorium of interest payments and repayment of loans, regulatory forbearance, and additional liquidity infusion. Fiscal measures mainly were for food security, rural employment generation, and the additional and health spending, and including spending for vaccination. But revenues were lower by 11.6% in nominal terms, and increase in the aggregate fiscal deficit was from 7.1% in 2019-20 to something 12.9% in 2021. Liabilities increased to almost 90% of GDP, and revenue deficit itself was almost 9.4%. There was a partial recovery in 21-22. GDP increased, nominal terms by almost 19%, and real terms by 8.9%. Fiscal deficit was contained at 9.8%, which was substantially lower than 12.9% you saw earlier. And the liabilities also came down to 80, so close to 85%. In fact, 15th Finance Commission was, doing many of these recommendations it was making during the time of the pandemic when it was almost about to end. And it said that there should be at least 3 reinforcing pillars. One is fiscal rules across all levels of government to specify multiple targets and escape clauses, public finance management systems, and strengthen the budgetary process, accrual accounting, and consolidation. Second, a modern public finance management system to provide comprehensive, consistent, reliable, and timely reporting of fiscal indicators as a part of the first pillar, and strengthen the fiscal institutions through an independent assessment mechanism to provide assurance and guidance on the working of the other 2 pillars, which is basically recommended the Fiscal Council. So this requires a mix of institutional reforms and use of technology. It also said that immediately after the pandemic is over, the government should really amend the Fiscal Responsible Budget Management Act and then work out realistic targets. I mean, it had made certain targets. In fact, the 4.5% for the center was one of the optimistic targets it had made. In fact, it had made 3 alternative targets, and one of them, depending upon the pace of recovery. The deficit and debt targets set before the pandemic are no longer relevant. We were talking about 60%, 70%, and this is no longer relevant. There is an interesting study by IMF which says in this stretched situation, it says that if the primary deficit is contained at 1.7% of GDP, if the growth rate and interest rate differential is 3.5%.
Govind, I'm sorry, we are going to run.
No, I'll have another 3-4 minutes. 3-4 minutes I'll have.
Yes, sir, it's a main process.
I mean, if you don't want me to continue, I'll stop it here if you want. But
No, the
otherwise, I have
focus
another
was on
3
G20 was international coordination. No, that's fine. You've given a good view of what's all wrong with
No,
India.
I want to. No,
So is that relevant
I
to
have
you?
some important thing
Sure.
to say
Go
for
ahead
3
and
more
tell us
minutes.
something about the
You
global.
either you give 3 minutes or I will stop it here.
I'll give you 5 minutes for something on global coordination.
No, I mean, I have whatever I wanted to talk about global coordination, I have said. There are some things I want to talk about India. And if you don't want me to talk, I will stop it here. You can proceed.
No lessons from India to the world? Come on. You must have learned a lot of lessons from India.
I have told Charan that I am going to be talking about the global issues first. And anyway, Professor Eichengreen has
Okay, you go ahead. I'll give you the whole 10 minutes. Go ahead.
I don't want your 10 minutes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
The IMF study has said that if deficit is growth interest rate differential is 5%, it will take 17 years to reach 70% of GDP. Now, India in the last 3 budgets have seen some notable improvements. They have been more comprehensive and transparent by including off-budget liabilities. They have been realistic and often conservative in terms of forecasts of revenue and deficits. There is a concerted effort at improving the quality of public spending by increasing capital expenditures to revive economy and accelerate growth process while continuing to attempt the fiscal consolidation. The Union Finance Minister has promised to reduce the fiscal deficit to 4.5% of GDP by 25-26 from the budgeted 5.4% in 23-24. This is an ambitious target and I hope she will be able to do it. And Union budget has an interesting proposal for lending $1 trillion to the states. But this has 2 objectives. One is, if the states, it is important for the center to continue, states to be sort of indebted to the center, because then only the center can control the state's borrowings. And obviously for 50 years, if you have a 0 interest rate, this thing, you can continue to control their overall this thing, but at the same time, it helps you to increase that capital expenditure. One important thing that has happened is that the tax collections in 2022-23 has substantially increased, both income tax and the GST. And that gives a lot of hope, because GST in particular, in fact, the buoyancy works out to 1.4, and the growth was 21% in 22-23 as compared to the previous year, which was, and previous year itself it was 29%, and hopefully, and much of it has come because of the better compliance as the technology platform has settled in. And with the better compliance, I think this could become an important driver in help. It could help in consolidating the debt much faster. So it's a time to act on fiscal management reform involving the three intermediate interdependent pillars, as I mentioned. And so the government will have to amend the FRBM Act and do the fiscal, public finance management reform, as sort of earlier than later. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashima, please go ahead.
Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Charan, for the invitation and selecting this really topical, and it's really good to be with such a distinguished panel. So I will talk about global fiscal coordination and experience of, say, India, US, and emerging markets, LICs in that context. So after the global financial crisis, we did have coordinated fiscal monetary expansion throughout the world. And with fiscal coordinated stimulus especially, since one country's fiscal stimulus can leak to others through a rise in trade, it's important, that it should be coordinated. But there is a basic asymmetry. Since with a fiscal deficit, the US can print dollars to finance it, while emerging markets face rating downgrades and higher borrowing costs and outflows. And this happened to emerging markets after the global financial crisis. India had double deficits, was thought to be going the Latin American way. And I think this gave us important lessons. There's just one figure I want to show. If it's not letting me share. Yeah, it's okay. It's not letting me share. You have to enable the sharing. Anyway, so this particular chart shows the revenue deficit.
Vivek, quickly help Professor.
Because I tried this in the beginning, it was working, but now it's saying the host has to enable the share. Share.
Please try now.
It's working. Yeah. You can see this. Yeah. So this shows the global financial crisis. Here we saw that there was this very sharp rise in all three deficits. This shows the first line, dotted line is a fiscal deficit, the revenue deficit, the primary deficit. And before that was a high growth period where all this was coming down, all the deficits were coming down. While in the 80s, this is when the government was really borrowing and spending. That is when all three deficits started rising. And one of the effects of this persistent borrowing over a long period is that you accumulate debt and you have interest payments, which was why in the high growth period, even when other deficits fell, the revenue deficit continued to rise, the blue line. So another thing to note is the lesson we learned from the global financial crisis, I think, was that, as Arvind was saying, he had said that you must reverse the stimulus. It was not reversed. So you have this plateau. All the deficits continued to be high for a number of years. And after that, because of the double deficits and the financial problems, very slow growth. So the improvement in deficits was really limited. Now we see in pandemic times, there's this sharp rise, a peak. But the lessons we have learned partially, and as Govind Rao was telling us, there's certain improvements in budgetary practices, etc. You see, or perhaps it was, as Dr. Eichengreen was saying, the inflationary reduction in debt. Last year we had higher inflation, but Indian inflation was still not that high. So I think it is a combination of a reduction in deficits and so on. So you see that it's like a peak, not a plateau. There is a faster reversal this time, which bodes well for the future. So now when we compare India with other countries, as you know, very timely, the IMF spring meetings talk about world debt, and they show expected debt ratios for a number of countries till the end of the decade. And they expect the US debt to rise back to the 20s peak of almost 140% of GDP. China will also rise because of slower growth. But other countries, emerging markets and advanced, will fall about 2 to 5% of GDP each, while so global government debt will stay constant at about 100. But now India has already fallen 5% in 2 years, from 89 peak to about 84. But the IMF projects that Indian debt will be constant till 27. But I think that the improvements in policy, the lessons we've learned over the past, where we had overshooting of monetary fiscal stimulus and then over tightening in the past decade. So this time I've coined this term BCCR. It stands for balance, coordination, counter-cyclical, and reforms. So we have all these factors in our macroeconomic policy. And as Dr. Eichengreen showed us, this R minus G. Typically in an emerging market, in a growth catch-up period, growth is much higher. India's growth is much higher, has been higher than that of many advanced economies. But over the last 2 decades, it has been very volatile. And you had periods where real interest rates have shot up. So now the idea of counter-cyclical and smoothing is that you keep these real interest rates below growth rates. And I think this contributes to the sharp reduction in debt we have seen. And so my own estimate would be that there will be a much better reduction in debt than the IMF has forecast. Then let's come to the US slightly. The US faces a number of dilemmas. Just as India had overreaction in policy, they've had overreaction in fiscal policy during the pandemic. And as I was saying, they have the advantage of printing dollars. So in a way, this was using the dollar dominance because you could finance deficits easily. And then there was overreaction in monetary policy after inflation materialized. And in a way, the justification for this is to maintain dollar dominance. But a sharp rise in interest rates creates a lot of volatility in capital flows, and then exchange rates for all other countries. And this reduces confidence in the dollar. It also creates spillovers for the US itself, exposes fault lines in their own financial system, which again reduces confidence in the dollar. Prudential regulation can reduce the impact of monetary policy on the financial sector, but it cannot be tightened in a crisis. In these spring meetings, the IMF is telling us that they need to continue to keep rates high, but they must use prudential regulation. But you can't suddenly tighten during a crisis. It will make things worse. It has to be used prior. But in the US, no prudential regulation was lightened for small banks, and none is imposed on the non-bank financial sector. So there are financial fault lines and potential spillovers. So then rising interest rates are also a problem for government debt. Advanced economy government debt rose from about 85% of GDP in 2005 to 140% during the pandemic. But average debt servicing actually fell. It was 2% of GDP to 1.5% in the pandemic. Because the US, the treasury yields were so low, interest rates were around zero. 10-year US GSEC rates were 1% pre-pandemic. But they had risen to 4.25 in October 22 before falling now with the SVB crisis. But the caution is that in the early 1980s, when inflation was high and Volcker raised interest rates, they reached 15.4%. And the US share of interest payments in the budget reached an unacceptable 25% of the revenues were going in interest payments. In India, the figure currently is 40%, because we have to pay much higher interest rates. So then they imposed the Budget Enforcement Act, which worked much better than the other earlier Graham-Hollings Act. and there were caps on spending and with escape clauses, and insisting on a pay-as-you-go system. So a new kind of scheme could only be started if the financing is shown. And then Greenspan sort of reduced the policy rate, supported fiscal conservatism, and this worked very well. Combination of fiscal conservatism and monetary adjustment, and it brought down debt in the Clinton years. The current consensus is that this inflation bout and the tightening will keep real rates will stay low. But this is not necessary. And moreover, as again Dr. Eichengreen pointed out, it's not good for the dollar if it is due to inflation. Confidence in the dollar will fall. Now, the dollar remains the hegemon, the reserve currency and the transaction currency of the world. And no other currency is as strong. But many payment innovations are making moves away from the dollar possible. But this might impose discipline that will help, just as large share of interest payments impose some discipline in the 80s and 90s. So, as a rule-based democracy, the US is very important for global stability. But to retain its dominance and reduce negative spillovers to others and to itself, it is necessary to avoid extremes of monetary and fiscal policy, to respect rules and to avoid unilateralism. Now we come to LICs. I'll just briefly touch upon this in the interest of time. Again, the IMF World Bank estimates something like 15 to 60% of low-income countries are in or approaching debt distress. And emerging markets sovereign yields have gone up from 5 to about 8. So the interest cost of borrowing is rising. The cost of borrowing for 25% of highly indebted countries is very high. And the G20 common framework for debt reduction has not worked. 3 countries only have shown interest in it, but nobody has really used it. And all the literature shows that very deep restructuring of debt is required for it to work. It has to be generous. But the problem is that now the Paris Club is not the dominant creditor. There are bilateral creditors, China, there are private creditors. So it's very difficult for creditors to reach agreement. And this issue of China insisting that the Bretton Woods institutions have to take a haircut. Now, just in the TF5 we've been discussing, and as Franny was saying last time, that this triple AA for the MDBs is something that is implicit. It is not a legal that you have to repay the MDBs, but people repay because that serves as the basis on which other loans are priced. So maybe if China is coming around, it's all right. But the reforms in the international financial architecture, you want that there should be layering, that the MDBs should be, that all the regional and national development banks should work together to improve the quantity and reduce the cost of funding for emerging markets. So I was wondering if this PCT status, if it's there with the Asian NDB, with the Asian Investment Bank, the Chinese promoted one, then China should accept that, that none of the development banks take haircuts, but they use that preferred creditor status to use capital more efficiently, to leverage capital more, make more loans. So that was just one suggestion. There are many others. And then climate finance, so this is another crisis facing the world, and ways to make funding more generous under mitigation, adaptation. And if this can help relieve pressure on certain indebted countries. And of course, most important in this is to reduce the cost of borrowing, where you need some kind of more effective hedging, where I suggested maybe reinsurance, catastrophe risk, because I see in the data that actual volatility is higher in emerging markets, but you don't see that kind of sharp depreciation, which markets want a high interest rate to cover. So, some kind of reinsurance and using the information with the IMF to reduce the cost of this insurance might really help reduce costs for emerging markets and low-income countries that have to borrow. Thank you, Astro.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, we already run out of time, but anyway, Dr. Roy, please go ahead.
Thank you, Arvind. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion. Coming in at the end, I would like to first focus on a couple of theoretical, I think, changes that have happened in the lived experience in developed and emerging economies on fiscal monetary coordination because of the ending of certain assumptions underlying the monetary policy and fiscal policy approaches these countries have had. This was most remarkably seen in the UK. And of course in India, but India one puts it down to maybe capacity issues in the central bank nowadays, but certainly in the UK, the consistent inability of the Bank of England to come with any kind of established link between what they do on interest rates and what happens to inflation. There have been cases where they have put interest rates on hold and inflation has fallen. There have been quarters when they have raised interest rate and with a lag, inflation has risen. And everything that you can possibly think of in terms of the relationship between inflationary expectations even and what the bank has done with its prime rate has led to a questioning of the underlying theory regarding the use of the interest rate as an instrument to manage inflationary expectations and inflation. This is causing quite a bit of discussion here in London. And also I was fortunate to get out of this fund bank reform thing, which I went to Washington for, attend a couple of macro meetings there. And the mood was quite somber within the OECD about this particular theoretical facet. On debt, interestingly enough, I think what Barry is saying is being internalized, at least in European policy circles. In that, there is a realization that the countries are going to have to live for some time now with high levels of debt, high debt levels. Now the question then becomes, how do you manage the negative consequences of living with these higher debt levels? And in the current situation, aging economy, lack of investment in almost everything, unwillingness politically to take hard decisions to lower interest costs, such as you saw in France, pessimism regarding the future of Germany's ability to maintain balance of trade surpluses. All this is showing that one is basically preparing for a high cost, high debt, rich country world. The consequences of this are quite apparent. In the UK, children's school meals are means tested at £8,000 a year. The per capita, that is about $10,000. The per capita income of the UK is $44,000 a year. As you know, in India, school meals are not means tested for anybody who goes to a public school, and our per capita income is $2,000 a year. So the fact that it is fiscally unaffordable to provide free school meals to British kids at anything for anybody who earns more than 1/5 of the per capita income is the fiscal reality that is being faced in the UK and in France and in Germany and in Italy. And of course, in many of the other smaller countries. I think the Holland is exempt and the Scandinavians are okay. America's lived with this for a long time, no point discussing America. So I think the situation here has become one in which it's an unholy, horrible situation to be in. I'm very glad that emerging economy is not in it, where the government is fiscally constrained, not because it is spending more, but is in fact spending very little, but is nevertheless fiscally constrained. And there is not much monetary policy is able to do to help this because inflation is high. The only magic bullet that many of these countries are looking for is to increase productivity. European productivity is low and British productivity is the lowest in Europe. So there is some scope for increasing productivity, but that has led more to calls for industrial policy rather than fiscal or monetary policy. And top that with the war in Ukraine, which is a war of the Europeans' own choice. No one forced them to react to, as I keep telling my friends here, no one forced them to react to Russia invading Ukraine. And obviously it was going to have a cost. And that cost has come not in terms of guns and metal, but in terms of high energy prices. And that is having to be managed now. And that means, of course, that which needs to be the second part of my sort of discussion on this, that the entire investment push to climate-proof the economy is now in jeopardy. Because the immediate concern is to open up coal mines. Germany's done that. Not to shut down nuclear power plants, to rely more on oil and gas, to get cheap energy to households in what is effectively a massive cost of living crisis with high inflation. And we all know that once you open up coal mines, it's not very easy to shut them. So I think that's the situation in Europe. I think Ashima and Barry have both covered the US, which is actually quite interesting because the US has seen recently one of its highest growth phases and is very aggressively using its sort of monopoly currency provider status and its ability to cause tantrums in almost every other G20 country for its own benefit. Not to mention its Clean Environmental Act and the move to protectionism. That's another story. So I think the US is okay. Now, coming to the emerging economies, it is quite interesting. Some have more or less reconciled themselves to the fact that their ambitions will have to be curtailed, made much more modest. That is possibly a good thing. It's better to have modest ambition than to boast about big things in the future. And those two are India and Brazil. India has very quietly suddenly made a virtue of 8% growth, or 6% growth, I beg your pardon. I do not see much talk anymore of double-digit growth. I do not see much talk about 8% growth even. I see almost a sense of relief that the country is able to do 6% growth and a prayer that it does so sustainably. And as Dr. Rao was saying, fiscal, I think, management has improved quite considerably the last 3 years, but so has its modesty. The reason why public investment is going up is because nothing else is happening. Consumption is not firing. Private investment is not firing. So G has to rise, and the government quite correctly is doing what it can within its very limited means to prop up public investment. I hope it is successful, because it's one thing to provide money for public investment, it's another thing to complete and finish it, as we know from very bitter experience of our past. But if it does so, then the best India can hope for is to chug along at about 6.5% growth. The China dividend is not coming. I hope everyone sees that that is fairly clear. Such China dividend that there is going to Vietnam, Mexico, other countries, not India. So on the X front, that's still unfinished business, but I don't think that business is going to finish in the next 3 or 4 years. But that is actually a sweet spot to be in, because that means with modest fiscal and monetary policy, acceptance of a slightly higher level of debt. And I think everyone is right. I think I'm not expecting, I'm with Ashima. I do think that debt will fall more than the IMF thinks it will in the short run. But I don't see it falling to the ambitions of the FRBM committee I was part of or previous finance commissions. It's going to stay up there, It's going to stay up there in the 70s. Because things happen, events happen, and then money has to be spent, such as the private sector stops investing. So you have to put in public investment. The best will in the world. Brazil has also moderated its growth ambitions. Turkey has followed a somewhat bizarre path, and so has South Africa, in terms of fairly, may I say, debauched macroeconomic policy, which has effectively meant that these are not growth engines. China is facing base effects finally, and therefore is going to provide moderate growth going forward. But none of these emerging economies have the sort of dilemma that the OECD countries have in being high per capita income countries who are unable to prevent immunization and are fiscally constrained by that inability, leading to extreme conflict and tension, compounded by the first European war since World War II. Coming finally to the low-income countries, there has been a fairly dramatic, the IMF is becoming quite radical. They have a climate policy, they have a gender policy. I suppose they'll be joining the Socialist Party next or something. But the most radical thing that happened in Washington was the IMF called for a debt relief package for Africa, saying that that debt is simply not sustainable. And I was very impressed by that. That takes some candor. This was from the Africa department. But that leaves Africa in a very difficult position, because it is impossible, because this will be the third time that we'll be providing debt relief to Africa. I have no argument against providing debt relief to Africa, because one of the problems with the current way in which money is lent, and I've been at the center of discussion on this now for the past month, is that because it is lent in US dollars, And because there is often depreciation that happens in local currency, not because the government is running a current account deficit, that is borrower risk, but because there's tapering, or because natural resource prices rise because of European war, or because there's a pandemic and demand for commodities collapses. These countries are then faced with structural difficulties which are exogenous to their own efforts. But the inexorable need to pay back in a foreign currency remains. I've been arguing, therefore, that like the EBRD, I think the Bretton Woods institutions, the regional development bank should actually try and find ways in which they can ramp up lending in domestic currency. And I think that would be very helpful to Africa. Surprisingly, Africa has the equipment in place. Most Southern African economies follow the Rand. The East African economies are almost at a currency union. The Central and West African economies already have a currency union. So there will not be much difficulty there. But that is unfortunately not being put on the table, citing all sorts of things like rating agencies will not give us a AAA rating. But I think that the multilateral institutions either have to change the way the rating agencies think, or accept, like the BRICS Bank did, like the NDB did, perhaps a lower rating in exchange for taking on this extreme source of risk and volatility that befuddles fiscal and monetary policy making in Africa. For the rest, and finally, you have the basket cases. Regrettably, two of them in our country, which have, sort of debauched their economies entirely through policies of their own making, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and a few others not of their own making, such as the small island states. The final challenge that is going to come, and I'll end with this, to, I think, macro, fiscal, and monetary coordination, is the fact that on the real side, now there is an attempt to coordinate action and to ask for finance to do so. I'm referring here to the twin challenges, one that we thought we had put behind us, except in Africa, but which has come back with a vengeance to bite us in both advanced and emerging economies. And that is the challenge of poverty, not inequality, poverty. And the other is the climate challenge. Discourse at the spring meetings was all about finding the money to meet both these challenges. And the sums spoken of were in trillions. Now, at a mega macro level, that doesn't matter. Annual savings are $7 trillion a year. But at the fiscal monetary management level, it is very, very difficult to think in this particular environment with these debt numbers and with these sort of domestic constraints of a scaling up in finance to resolve what the world seems to have agreed on the real sector side to be the two principal challenges that the globe faces and for which global coordination, including fiscal coordination especially, but also monetary coordination is required. I think this is going to bedevil us, this difficult choice that we're going to have to make with a situation where debt is high, countries that are rich are fiscally constrained, countries that are emerging are either in basket case scenario or like India and Brazil have wisely moderated their expectations to maintain prudence and maintain stability. And the conundrum of African debt being repeatedly unserviceable as a consequence of purely, largely external shocks. I bring to attention Ghana, Zambia, a number of other countries. Second, third time this is happening. So I think this is the difficult world going ahead, and perhaps we will have to rethink our coordination dimensions, I think, both by calibrating them between countries and by paying more attention to the rich country challenge than we perhaps have been doing over the past 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you. I would have concluded this, but I think there are 2 or 3 lessons from GFC which I don't think have been learned. So I'm going to take the time, though we are well over our time. One is from India. There was a very clear, as CA, I had a very clear picture. There were 3 elements of the adjustments which we had in fiscal. One was automatic stabilizers. The decline in GDP meant that tax revenues would go down. And that was a deliberate thing that had to happen. You had to stop withdrawing funds out of the system. The second one was expenditures. I had opposed, and the budget, it was a surprise to me when the loan waiver was done. I publicly, in a meeting outside, said I did not agree with it. But when the global financial occurred, I saw this as the fastest way to inject money into the economy. I completely changed because of the GFC, not because of anything else. The crisis meant you had a decline in credit of like 50%. you had a decline in GDP of 30%. I don't remember the exact number right now. So you had to act fast. So at that point, I argued for accelerating the loan waiver so that money would go to the farmers who could spend it. The third element was a temporary tax reduction in the indirect taxes mainly, but whatever politically was feasible. But we did indirect. That one I was very clear had to be reversed probably in the next budget, but definitely as soon as GDP recovered. And it had recovered by the next year, that was not reversed. And by that time I had left, so I was not there in the budget. The second element was that in 2010, there was a spectrum auction, which was a huge one-time boom in revenues. The logic of economics, which I had spelled out before I left, suggested that we should have used that entire amount to reduce the deficit. No, they did the opposite. They used it to sustain. The third point, though I don't want to blame anybody, but my successor as CA, I know, developed a special model which could justify continuing monetary expansionism because everybody was saying we have to start cutting down on monetary expansion. He developed a model. He's a brilliant economist. I won't name him. You can go and look it up. You know. So the economics to me was very clear. Maybe it wasn't to others. We did not do it. Okay. So the lesson is you have to pragmatically. It was not ideology. The main point is that's precisely my point. I was not ideological, but the rationale of economics without worrying about ideology was not followed. The second part after that, I went to the IMF. Over there, I argued that giving this huge amounts of money to countries which could not recover, Greece in particular, possibly Ireland and later Italy, that what would happen was the IMF giving all these funds, they would be paid, the private lenders would be paid, and they would come back. That's exactly what started happening. And I was very clear that there has to be a haircut. Nobody listened. I was the sole person in the IMF board who was arguing this point. So it seems that this lesson has been learned, that you cannot just keep injecting money into it. Now, here the problem is it's less the private sector and more China is a big lender now. So they have to be on board, because what's going to happen is if the IMF and others just give the loan, the Chinese are going to be repaid. It won't help the country. So from what I hear, what was just reported by Dr. Roy, that maybe the IMF has learned that lesson. Okay, with that, let me end the seminar. We are way over time. I think we've taken 25 minutes. Charan, you want to make some point and then we can finish off?
Sir, our time was till 9:30.
Oh, it was? Okay, sorry. I thought it was 9.
No, it's
Okay,
9:30.
we have 5 minutes.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes, and if Barry would agree and others would permit, we could extend it by 5 minutes or so if there are interesting
I'm
questions.
afraid I'll also have to go, so maximum 5 more minutes. Yeah, because I had got 9 o'clock.
So can I ask a quick question, sir?
Yes, please.
So with Barry in the panel and then illustrious professors like Govinda, Ashima, and practitioner, my friend Rathin, I'm tempted to ask a question, sir. The question is, the times are difficult. What decides what colors and biases our opinion about debt GDP ratio is the Maastricht Treaty. And I always thought that was for normal times. And I never could find the sanctity of those figures of 3% and 60% ever. Though I've tried for 2 decades, it's empirically possible, but theoretically none. Then the issue is, in difficult times, once in a century, a pandemic, what was the alternative? And if you do not incur these and the government doesn't intervene, and Keynes probably the story of pump priming is not invoked at this stage, when will it be? Because if debt is not there, how are we going to sustain demand? How is the recovery going to take place? So my question, sir, is in such difficult times, for a certain period, could we think of an accommodative fiscal policy? And so the other thing is that the indicators, because Barry has done so much of work on debt, should we also start thinking in terms of interest payment outgo as a percentage to the budget that should be another parameter to think in terms of a fiscal policy. Thank you.
If I
Would you like to take it up? Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to take it up because I have a hard stop in 3 minutes. I have another
Sure. Yeah.
meeting to go to. In fact, the Maastricht convergence criteria that debts should not be greater than 60% of GDP and deficits greater than 3% of GDP were totally arbitrary. Those were the average levels at the time the treaty was negotiated. So that's sometimes how economic policy decisions are made or mismade. The book I showed you in my presentation, In Defense of Public Debt, does make the case that in emergencies, fiscal policy is a critically important instrument in wars, financial crises, pandemics. The unfortunate fact is that these emergencies have been coming faster than ever in recent decades, and that we have not done a good job at reversing out the implications of the extraordinary fiscal action that we have taken. I think political circumstances make that difficult with polarized politics. You can't get agreement on whose taxes to raise and what spending to cut. With slower economic growth, which the IMF and World Bank are now forecasting worldwide over the next decade, growing out of the problem becomes harder. I do very much agree with what Arvind said in passing, that one helpful set of reforms is stronger fiscal institutions. I think a couple of panelists mentioned independent fiscal councils and greater fiscal transparency. Those things won't solve our inherited fiscal problems, but they will hopefully prevent us from compounding them. So thank you. If I excuse myself, I hope you forgive me.
Thank you.
Let me just come in with two operational responses to what Sharan said. I had recommended this during the pandemic, and only the European Central Bank took me on, which is to issue what you do in a war. If this is genuinely a once-in-a-lifetime event, the pandemic, and spending can be established to be rising only because of the pandemic, issue perpetuals, consols. That's what Keynes did, and that's what Britain did in the Second World War. So then your debt liability does not matter because you never pay back the debt. It's traded, you don't pay it back. I recommend it in India, but for some bizarre reason, only the ECB called me up and did do it. The second point, Charan, is you're right about interest, but it's very, very important to distinguish between domestic debt and foreign debt in that case. I find it very surprising the IMF doesn't do it adequately. It is very, very important to look at interest outgoes as a proportion of anything you like in the denominator, but it's a very different case when you have domestic debt and therefore domestic interest payments and foreign debt. Thanks.
And I just want to say the following.
Govind, yeah.
I just want to say the following. And that is that counter-cyclical policy is important, and obviously there is nothing cast in iron that we should have 60% or 70%. I mean, that's not the issue. Issue, however, is that, when you're talking about the debt, ultimately, what is the interest payment that, you will have to bear, and how much of money you'll have to pay from interest from your revenues. And you need to keep an eye in the medium term. Obviously, when the economy is down, there is no this thing. But in normal times, you'll have to be very careful. The more important than that is, as I said, counter-cyclical is all right. But at the same time, when you are borrowing money, fiscal deficit when you have, you need to see what is your household sector financial saving. If the entire household sector financial saving is taken away by the government, the borrowing cost for the private sector goes up. And when the borrowing cost for the private sector goes up, and you say, so private sector is not investing, obviously private sector will not invest when the borrowing cost goes up. And today we have a household sector financial saving of around 8.5 to 9%. And then, our fiscal deficit, and if you take public enterprises also, public sector borrowing requirements is much more than that. And that's why they said that, there is a financial crowding out and things like that. But when the private sector is not really active and not really coming up, then obviously the government will have to come in.
Thank you. Do you want to, yeah, Ashima, you want to say something? We'll kind of end
Just a
it
very
and I
quick,
have to go. Yeah,
quick response to Charan's question.
yeah.
I think, we confuse this fiscal deficit has become something that is there for government as a stimulus, that even analysts say, oh, the government's fiscal stimulus has decreased, growth will fall, etc., etc. But theory tells us that in a crisis, if there's a steep fall in demand, government borrows and spends, it raises growth and it will help a recovery, and that is justifiable. So that is the pandemic time. But in this pandemic, the problem was the supply side also was absolutely demolished. So that extra spending just led to inflation. But when people confuse this, that if you say there's poverty, inequality, and so on, and you want to and that is a political issue and only the government can take decisions, but it can't be corrected by a deficit. It has to be more taxation. Government has to tax and then give to the poor. That is absolutely essential. I mean, there's a lot of confusion where we're seeing on TV program somebody saying, हाँ तो वो tax बढ़ा रहे हैं और फिर दे रहे हैं, इसका क्या फायदा? So we have to be clear about that. But that said, there is a issue that government spending, which increases output. In India, we have supply bottlenecks which are restraining output. We have a lot of unemployment. So if the government is spending more on investment, infrastructure, on relieving supply bottlenecks, and they borrow to do that, that is all right, but not borrowing for redistribution. Yeah.
Thank you. So you again talked about the pandemic. So let me say, in early in the pandemic, at the time of the lockdown, we wrote several papers, and the key point we made in the first at EGROW, I was at EGROW, was that unlike the global financial crisis, which was largely a demand shock, that pandemic was clearly going to be a supply and demand shock. And in 3 months or so, we had defined the different nature. Of course, from the old literature on epidemics, the old shocks used to be supply of labor, right? A lot of people get infected, they can't work, many of them die. So it was basically a labor shock in the case of old pandemics. But then we generalized it and looked at it after 3 months. We had a paper which showed that in this case, because of the lockdowns, it's a completely different. In those days, people just died. There were no lockdowns, there were no vaccines. They died, the supply shrunk. Here it was going to be more complicated. It was going to be different commodities, different geographies. The general point we had got, the exact how it would happen, obviously, as it evolved, we learned what was going on. But it was very clear, and we've said it in our initial 2 papers, that is going to be both a demand and a supply shock. So some of that is not new, but absolutely what the implication was that you have to be very careful, which is why we concluded it has to be very focused, and it cannot be a general expansionary goal. It has to be focused and directed at specific sectors, making sure that you don't use this uselessly in creating demand for where there was no supply. But that was only, the conclusion was this was in the transition. But unfortunately, we had different waves. We had different waves in different countries, and the whole thing became way too complicated. I fully admit that it became so complicated, it went beyond any concept one had in 2020 or early 21, definitely. Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't have.
Yeah, but I think Indian policy did internalize this and it made a difference.
That's right. So anyway, I'm sorry, we've had a long discussion. This is longer than the last 2 we've had on monetary, G20 monetary. So okay. I'm sorry, but Charan, if you want to continue, please go ahead. I have to go. Thank you all. Sorry, I have to go. Charan, over to you.
So let me conclude. Firstly, thank the chairman for sparing time and being with us, and all the panelists, Professor Barry Eichengreen, Professor Govinda, Professor Ashima, and Dr. Rathin. I want to thank each one of you. It's pretty late, but because we are working around the globe, so we requested each one of you, and we have done it finally. I really thank each one of you for an excellent discussion. It's so apparent. The recording will be available tomorrow by noon on our website. Please feel free to use it. And the topic next week, again under EGROW G20 Task Force 5, is financial inclusion. So I would invite all of you, and the timing will be 6 to 7:30. We'll discuss, and we have somebody from America, and we have 2 experts from India speaking about financial inclusion. I would invite all of you to please spare 90 minutes and be with us next Friday, 6 to 7:30. With that, let me once again thank all the participants, speakers, and the chairman to be with us today and discuss this important topic. Thank you and good night.